Welcome back, students. So the last time that we were together, we were talking about the Minoan civilization. And I want you to think back using these images to a couple of things that we talked about. But we talked about really beautiful murals, a highly advanced civilization. We talked about palace walls being full of images that taught us something about the Minoans, perhaps. We talked about bowl leaping, and we looked at bowls in all sorts of fashions. In fact, we even looked at the legend of the Minotaur and a beautiful woman of Pasiphae giving birth to a half bull, half man, according to legend. So we looked at Minoan bowls, but we also looked at the Minoan seascapes on the walls of the palace. And we talked about how colorful and beautiful that these were, and how people were also represented. And perhaps we could learn something about the Minoan civilization from the athletic build and the lack of clothing on the bodies of the Minoan people. Again, a reference to sea life. We talked a little bit about gender roles and a little bit about what sort of symbolizes and shifts and tells us that a society is becoming more advanced, like the style of clothing that they're wearing and the amount of time and energy they're able to put into things like their hair. And I think somebody also mentioned the continuity, the idea of a style being represented by on women or on men. Okay. We're going to talk about whatever happens to this Minoan civilization. And I will tell you right now that sometimes in history, we don't have really great answers. We have theories and we don't have things that we can't put a definitive answer on this, but we're going to talk about the theories around the Minoan culture's mysterious end. So sometime between about 1700 BCE and about 1450 BCE, things start to go awry for the Minoan civilization. Okay, we remember that they were really powerful seafaring people. So the sea was their life, but sometimes your life can also be, the thing that brings you the most pain. And so some historians theorize that earthquakes caused such damage to the island of Crete over a period of about 300 years that they had to spend a lot of time rebuilding their own civilization and weren't able to keep track so well of those that they had been in control of outside. That makes a lot of sense, and there's all kinds of archaeological evidence that reaffirms the idea that these earthquakes were prevalent in the region at the time. So there's lots of evidence to suggest that the earthquakes really happened. It's pretty easy to tell when a civilization is rebuilding itself because there's different materials, there's different layers and things like that. So they can see that on the ground when they're doing an archaeological dig. Some people say that the earthquakes were actually triggered by a massive volcanic eruption, which was actually documented historically. So there was a massive volcanic eruption on the island of Thera, and the island of Thera is not very far away from the island of Crete. And they say that a combination of volcanic dust blocking out the sun for a period of time, crusting upon most of the Minoan cities, and also probably triggering earthquakes and tsunamis, that the combination of what would have occurred after that volcanic eruption could have taken people out and brought about the demise of the Minoans. Others say that it was just a transition of power, that all these things, yes, all these things happened. You can't argue with that because there's really firm archaeological evidence of that. But other people say that it didn't kill off all the Minoan people, and the Minoan people obviously rebuilt themselves after this. You can see them doing it. However, the power shift just happened. So the Minoan civilization eventually started to decline, and civilizations out on the outside edges began to rise, and there was simply a power shift. And so the Greeks end up taking control of the Minoans instead of the Minoans having control over the Greeks. Now, there's some pretty good evidence to suggest that this sort of thing might make sense as well, and I'll show you that in just a minute. So here's the island of Thera, island of Crete, and here's some references to what possibly could have happened. Some people say, though, this theory right here makes the most sense. So most recently, the National Geographic is doing research that started, I think, in around 2018. The article I read was written in 2019, and it talks about the Minoan civilization simply being absorbed by the Greeks. So they didn't go anywhere. They just became absorbed, if you will. The ideas got absorbed by the Greeks, and then after a period of time, we couldn't tell the Greeks and the Minoans apart anymore, and the Greek city-states were in control of the island of Crete. So the evidence that they point to is the writing style in the Minoan civilization. So when we first start off, the Minoan civilization is using something called Linear A writing style. So their earliest writings include things that look a lot like hieroglyphics. So look right here, you kind of look like the shape of a person, right? A circle at the top and a cross at the bottom. Oftentimes, this looks like a little ship here. So you can kind of see pictographs in Linear A. Not everything's easily decipherable, but you get the idea. What they say is emerging about the time period that they're falling is something called Linear B. And Linear B is a little bit different. It looks a little bit more like consistent letter patterns instead of pictographs. So it's a little bit less picturesque, a little bit less like hieroglyphics. Okay. And so they say that this Linear B replaces the Linear A. And they think what this means is that the Greeks there's a blending of influence. So obviously the Minoan civilization is going to have an impact upon the Greeks, but there seems to be a blending of writing styles, which might mean a blending of cultural ideas, which might mean an absorption of power. So here's more Linear B. And so just know at the end of the day, we don't have a firm grasp on why the Minoan culture ended. There's all sorts of theories: earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, invaders, absorption, the most recent being this idea of them just being absorbed, and the Linear A and Linear B evidence to suggest that. And then also there are other people that argue that the population of the island, when the items grew more scarce as a result of natural disaster, that there was infighting and that people just rebelled against the government. Okay. So there you go. I would say the least likely is the rebellion, because there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that the capital city was toppled or anything like that. So the Minoan civilization comes to an end, and then today we're going to talk about who is next in line and how do they impact the Greeks, because we're still not at the Greeks quite yet, but now we're going to talk about a group of people called the Phoenicians, and they're fairly close by. So goodbye, beautiful Minoan civilization. Look at how beautiful some of these palace walls are. Isn't that beautiful? Look at the different animals. So beautiful. Goodbye, Gnosis. And hello, Phoenicia. Okay, last screen for today. So what rose in the place of the Minoan civilization was a really powerful group of seafaring people that, again, just like the Minoans, were in control of trade, called the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were seafaring shipbuilders, and they were largely not in control of a firm area as much as in control of trade routes. So a lot of similarities to the Minoan civilization. So around 1100 BCE, we start to see these Phoenicians begin to dominate the eastern Mediterranean region, east of Crete. Let me show you a map here as you're getting that written down. You should be writing in your notebook. That's why I was pausing there. Okay. So after about 1100 BCE, after Crete's decline, the most powerful traders along the Mediterranean were the Phoenicians. Phoenicia was mainly the area which is now in Lebanon. So this is old Palestine, this is Israel, Lebanon, and Syria is right in this area today. Phoenicians never united into an actual country, but instead they founded a number of wealthy city-states around the Mediterranean that sometimes competed with one another. So Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre are going to be the most important that we talk about today, but I do want you to pay attention to Carthage over here, and Corsica, Sardinia, and Sicily. These islands are going to be very much a hot commodity along the Mediterranean trade routes. Okay, so they rise to power right here. You can see here's Crete and all this area to the east. And eventually, as they grow stronger, they're going to have city-states further and further out. This right here is the Strait of Gibraltar. So later on, I'm going to mention the Strait of Gibraltar, and it'll be important that you know like where I'm talking about. So the very first city-states in Phoenicia were Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre. And out of these city-states come some really important trade items. So the Phoenicians were really remarkable shipbuilders and seafarers, and they were the first along the Mediterranean to venture beyond the Strait of Gibraltar. Some scholars believe that the Phoenicians traded for tin with the inhabitants of the southern coast of Britain, and some evidence exists that an even more remarkable feat, sailing around the continent of Africa by way of the Red Sea and back through the Strait of Gibraltar, that they were even trading as far as that. So I'm going to show you really quickly. So not everybody buys this, but some people believe that not only were they here, but they traveled all the way out here. And this is a pretty remarkable feat because we're talking about vessels that are powered by men, and as a result, they can only go about 30 miles a day. So this trip around the coast of Africa would have taken years. You would have had to have gone a ways, stayed for a while, stayed for a monsoon season, and then continued on. So this trip here would have taken multiple years, multiple seasons. The Phoenician ships were rounded at the bottom and fairly flat down here, which gave them cargo space to store trade goods. They tended to store things in amphoras, so olive oil, wines, things like that stayed in amphoras. They towed along the back some sorts of trade items because the ship is not actually very big. And they tended to have horse heads in the front. Okay. Let's get rid of that again. Okay. Okay. The Greek historian Herodotus, who's considered the father of history, talks about the Phoenicians in this passage. So this is Herodotus' words in his book number 4, which he wrote in the 5th century BCE. The Phoenicians set out from the Red Sea and sailed around the Southern Sea, which is the Indian Ocean today. Whenever autumn came, they would put in and sow the land to whatever part of Libya, which is Africa, of course, they might come and there await the harvest. And then having gathered in the crop, they would sail on, so that after 2 years had passed, it was in the 3rd year that they rounded the Pillars of Heracles, Strait of Gibraltar, and came to Egypt. There they said that in sailing around Libya, that they had the sun on their right hand, which is in the reverse position. So that's kind of symbolic of they're on their way back and sailing back from this destination. So the Greek trireme is much like this early Phoenician ship in its build and in the way that it's powered. The Phoenicians' most important city-states in the eastern Mediterranean were Sidon and Tyre. And Sidon and Tyre were known for their production of this reddish-purple dye. Byblos was also a really important trading center, and it exported papyrus, which the papyrus paper was coming from Egypt, but the Phoenicians were the ones that were exporting it. So they were acting as kind of a trade hub. Phoenicians built colonies along the northern coast of Africa and the coast of Sicily, Sardinia, and Spain, and the colonies were about 30 miles apart, which was the distance a Phoenician ship could sail in a single day. The greatest Phoenician colony was at Carthage in North Africa, and settlers from Tyre founded Carthage in about 814 BCE. Okay, so one more time looking at the map. Byblos, from here we export, or the Phoenicians were exporting papyrus, which is paper. And the Bible gets its name from Byblos because one of the first books that's being written on that early paper is the Bible. And so that's where Bible gets its name. Sidon and Tyre were also exporting something really interesting and cool. And here we go to take a look at it. They were exporting a dye that had been produced from snails. They were produced from these snails called murexes, and these murex tend to be on the coast of Sidon and Tyre in that particular area. These murex snails exist. So what would happen is the people would go out and harvest the snail, and after you leave the murex to rot for a couple of days, it produces and oozes out a drop or two of this reddish purple liquid that can be used to create a dye. So if you leave to rot 60,000 of these murex snails, 60,000, you can produce a pound of dye. So because it's so, this requires so much effort and so many snails, the dye itself is really expensive. So one of the kind of legacies on the rest of the world that the Phoenicians leave behind is this symbolic red and purples that are used to represent royalty from this point for the next 500, 700 years. And even today, in some cultures, red and purple represents royalty. And the reason for that is that only royalty could afford it, because it requires 60,000 snails to produce a pound of the dye. So 60,000 murex snails to produce 1 pound of dye. Okay, last but not least, the Phoenicians treated goods that they got from other lands like wine and weapons and metals and ivory and slaves and paper, but they were also known as really superb craftsmen themselves. They worked in wood and metal and glass and ivory, and their red-purple dye was produced from the murex. We just talked about that. As merchants, the Phoenicians needed a way of recording transactions clearly and quickly, and so the Phoenicians also developed a writing system that used symbols to represent sounds. The Phoenician system was a phonetic alphabet, which means one sign was used for one sound, and in fact, the word alphabet comes directly from the first 2 letters of the Phoenician alphabet, which were Aleph and Beth. As they traveled around the Mediterranean, the Phoenicians introduced this writing system to their trading partners to use as a trade language. The Greeks, for example, will adopt the Phoenician alphabet and change the form of some of the letters to suit themselves, but largely the Greek alphabet is Phoenician. So here, take a look. And of course, the Greek alphabet becomes the Western alphabet. So the Phoenicians are great examples of this unit because we're talking about people and ideas on the move, and the Phoenicians are a people that control the movement of all kinds of things, goods, ideas, languages, and ways of working with the world. So take a look at the Phoenician alphabet and you can see similarities between the Phoenician Aleph, A, and your own. And the Phoenician B, which is Beth, and your own. So few examples of Phoenician writing exist. Most writings were on papyrus, and the unfortunate thing about papyrus is that it crumbles over time. However, the Phoenician contribution to the world was absolutely enormous. With a simplified alphabet, learning was now accessible to more people. Phoenicians' trade was upset when the eastern cities were captured by the Assyrians. However, these defeats encouraged exiles to set up city-states like Carthage to the west and actually led to the expansion of the Phoenician power away from the east and to the west. The Phoenician homeland later came under the control of the Babylonians and then the Persian Empire under King Cyrus I. One of their most lasting contributions, though, remains the spread of this alphabet. Okay, we're going to end with looking at this one more time. And Just FYI, we are 3/4 of the way through the unit. We'll have one more section to go in which we're going to stay in the same part of the world and see how Judaism emerges. I'm going to go back to the map just really quickly, even though I know that so right in this part of the world is also Israel. And we're going to talk about the Hebrew people coming to this particular region. The Phoenicians are already there, and Judaism is going to spring forth. Judaism is going to be the Old Testament of our Bible. Okay. Have a good day.